200 ships in total. This was only the first wave. They weren't quite as bold as they had been, though. They hadn't shocked nearly as close as they could have. Had their gambit worked, Renaud had no doubt that his force's survivors would be neck-deep in jackals this very moment. He'd burned their fingers. They weren't willing to approach without greater numbers. In less than 7 hours, he would be engaged by at least 2 of the 5 elements. 2 hours after that, he would be fighting all 5, plus whatever additional units the enemy had marshaled in that time. "I believe I owe you an apology in turn," Renaud said to Emile. The strategist raised his head. "Indeed?" "Yes. If a serpent was leading this force, those rail squadrons would already be maneuvering against us. One to shell us and the other to bombard our outriders as we attempted to close with the first group. They are holding back, waiting for support. Avians are statistically more likely to favor defensive stances," the thoughtful replied. "They prefer moving as large groups. Venio theorized that it is a result of their evolutionary psychology. Their ancestors hunted in large predatory flocks and their uplifting was scarcely 3 centuries ago." Emile continued. The Tribune nodded politely for a moment, before turning away. The carriers were launching their drones, hundreds of smaller red pinpricks appearing like the spread of a pathogen. "Execute Phase 2, Renaud ordered. The fleet began to move, adjusting its course towards the furthest of the jackal elements, one of the rail gunners. Those ships would either be forced to withdraw or engage Renaud's force all on their own. To observers, it would appear that Renaud's force was either withdrawing or extremely reluctant to engage the Escangé. Which is precisely what they were. The plan called for the jackals to be drawn away from their defense of Yultukdon, not faced in open battle. Yes, their fingers were burned and they would be hesitant to accept what their scopes were telling them, but they would still pursue, drawing more and more ships to their force. In the final analysis, it would look like a compact commander who had wanted to field test a new weapon and probe a command nexus's defenses. That was all Renaud asked of his enemy. That they would believe his lies until it was too late to do otherwise. "And so," the bastion leader said, standing upon the pulpit and looking down at his crew, "we truly begin to earn our victory." Tisserand curled his fingers into his palms as he watched the display. Execution Force Renaud almost fully engaged. After the failure of their decapitation strike, the jackals had thrown everything they had on hand at the armada. Every soldier's instinct in the group leader chafed at having to sit here, unable to affect the outcome. His comrades were fighting and dying, men and women he had known for years. All on the word of this emissary. This broken, with an effort, he pulled his gaze away from the status reports and shimmering dance of lights. It was all so clean, with no indication of the carnage unfurling in the blinking of light codes. The Tribune paused as he saw the human's expression. There was something there, but he could not have said what, only that he did not like it. The human stepped down from the command pulpit, moving over to the navigation console. "Get out," she said to Sectator Undatem, not even looking at the Tribune. Unda looked from the human to her commander. Tisserand nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral. Through the set of his jaw and the hardness of his expression betrayed him. The officer gave up her post, allowing the broken to climb onto the chair. The small female's thin fingers flew across the control board, screens, and holographic displays filling with equations, scrolling faster than Tisserand could see. She hesitated then, sitting back in the chair. The computer was still processing her data. All it needed was the final sequence to carry out the shock. The squadron status board pinged. The veiled archers were awaiting the code. "What are you waiting for?" Tisserand demanded. "They're out of position." Finish your work and jump the ships. Wait, Echo replied, holding up her forefinger. The group leader bit back on his first response. The sow was watching the telemetry feeds, her eyes darting back and forth. A moment passed. Another. The group leader's ire rose. Emissary, he hissed through clenched teeth. Again, the human did not even bother to look at him. Wait. Wait for what? For the moment. Disren counted to 10. The moment, he asked softly. A little smile fluttered across the human's lips, there and gone. Yes. The right moment. The jackals have been drawn away from their deadlines. Disren snapped. How much more right do you need it to be? Her head snapped towards him. Because they haven't been drawn away enough. There was a flatness to her voice, a lack of expression that was in itself disturbing, but her green eyes flashed. What we're seeing is old data, she pointed out. Those ships haven't been where we see them now for hours. They could have moved further out, to join up with other squadrons and formations in preparation for the assault on Redemption of Soul, or they could have moved back. Until I'm satisfied that they cannot interfere with our operation, I will not finish my calculations. We will wait. Our analysis, Disren's tactical officer interjected hotly. Is flawed, Echo interrupted. The deadness of her face gave way. Her lip curled as if the word itself was something foul. I won't let the brain-dead hulk you call a computer cause this operation to fail. Disren waved his tactical officer back to his station. And I suppose, he said, fighting to hold onto his temper, the Bastion leader had warned him of the Broken's impudence, but having to deal with the uppity little sow's unwarranted sense of importance was fraying his last nerve. That you have a superior insight into the tactical situation than the finest analysis engines in the force and the most capable officers in the flotilla. The human's features lost the hint of challenge. Yes, she replied, her voice once again turning flat. As I said. It's what I was made for. She raised her head, meeting Disren's gaze. It's why I was sent here by your triarch. Are you questioning your leader's wisdom? At that moment, the tribune would have rather bitten off his own tongue than given an answer. Of course not, he said quietly, holding on the edges of his temper. Where the triarchs lead, I shall follow. Echo turned back to the telemetry. Then we wait. Minutes passed, one after the other in agonizing slowness. Disren forced himself to remain quiet, running through the lessons of obedience in his head, but it was increasingly difficult to keep his own counsel. Every moment they tarried here was another moment in which the jackals arrayed more ships against the Bastion leader's fleet. Another moment in which a triarch's life was put in danger. He stared at the human, ignoring the twitching of her eyes and the faint coppery stink of her blood. Disren distracted himself with squadron status reports, trying not to pay attention to the fact that Bastion leader Rana now faced 300 warships. The noose was tightening and still they sat here, doing nothing. He was beginning to wonder if, perhaps, the triarch's faith in this Echo had been misplaced, when the creature shivered, a smile he couldn't identify on her lips. Her fingers danced, entering the final data points. The NAV computer hummed for a moment, confirming the human's work, as best it could. Disren had a background in navigation and even he was lost trying to follow it all. She looked over at him. Now. The group leader swiveled in his throne, snapping orders to his officers, the rest of the veiled archers digesting the data codes Echo sent to them. When all was in readiness, he nodded choppily to her. Her fingers flashed along the control board. There was the barest hesitation, then her lips twitched upwards. She said something in the bass, clicky human tongue. Reality shivered, twisted, and finally shattered as Echo drove 34 warships through it. They emerged, seconds later, in the heart of the Principality's defenses. An alarm screamed as, impossibly, Reconciliator emerged at the same coordinates as an Iskanjay citadel. Both station and ship vanished in a flare of energy too terrible to call an explosion. No, not even an explosion. The shock point had opened inside the citadel. The blood drained from Disran's face as he watched a mountain of armor bend, distorting in ways no physical law accounted for as it folded in on itself, forced into impossible geometries by the self-destructing shock point. How there was no time to wonder, more dirges blared with the deaths of more of Disran's command. Reconciliator was only the first. Heart of Glory slammed into another jackal fortress. Crucible of Judgment. Fanged Bite. Zenkara. 5 battle cruisers immolated themselves against the Iskanjay defenses along with 6 destroyers. Almost a third of Disran's squadron died in the reversion and half of the attached escorts. The group leader was out of his throne in a heartbeat. "What is this?" he cried. "You said you could jump us with perfect accuracy." The human female raised her head. "I did." For an instant, Disran was confused, a heated denial on the tip of his tongue. And then comprehension dawned. She had done this, the treacherous little broken whore had betrayed them. With a roar, the group leader threw himself at the human, intending to rip her limb from limb. There was a flicker of movement behind him and he found himself pinned, strong arms wrapped around his shoulders, holding him in place. "Patron, no." "Advocate," submissive Tanum hissed in Disran's ear. "You cannot. You must not. She is an emissary." Disran bit back the barrage of curses he wanted to spew at the soldier, but he forced himself to stop struggling. An emissary of the Triarchs was as inviolate as they were. If he were to harm her, no matter how justified, it would mean his death. Part of him screamed that it didn't matter, that all the thousands of men and women she'd just murdered had to be avenged, the friends he'd just lost. She was looking at him. There was no fear in her green eyes, not the dull countenance he'd seen in other broken. There was something else, something vivid and bright. There was contempt. "You are wasting time," she said in Odavam. "The window of vulnerability I've created will not last long." Her words were like a slap in the face and the group leader held up a hand to signal his assent to the Janissary's pleas. Slowly, carefully, Tanum released his superior. "Explain," Disran demanded. "Explain quickly." The human pointed at the main tactical display. "Look," she insisted. "The minefield that you expected to have to cut through Zenkara swept it for you. The fortress that would have rained fire on your squadron until it died, Reconciliator destroyed it." She adjusted a control, zooming in. It was true, the Jackal Citadel had been gutted, what little of it that was still identifiable. Echo showed Disran more images of the mangled remains of the Iskanjay's defenses. "I used your ships to open a hole in their defenses. It's possible you could have done it with fewer losses. It's likely that you couldn't have. I chose not to risk it." Disran forced himself to evaluate what the human was saying. It took every erg of willpower that he had. He looked at the display, biting back his rage. He saw ruined stations, minefields spasming out the last of their lives in self-destructive frenzies, webs of hunter-killer satellites deprived of orders. The command nexus was scarred and brutalized along this entire flank, its guns destroyed and scopes burned to uselessness. Data links between control facilities and their subordinates had been torn asunder. Communication intercepts were panicked and confused. The principality had been thrown into complete paralysis by the brutality of the assault. The devastation his dead ships had wrought had been catastrophic. The Broken had used his vessels, used their forming shock points, to tear the heart from the defenses around the command nexus. Even more terrifying than the wanton carnage the human had committed was the precision of it. She had been right. She had jumped his squadron with a perfection that none of Disran's navigators could match. No computer could have done it, either. The right moment, the emissary had said. This had been that moment, and the Tribune felt something cold worm its way into his liver. Madness and disease. She was looking at him. His officers were too. Disran forced himself to speak slowly and calmly. You should have told me. You might have said no. The human raised her head in challenge. I am told over and over how loyal the compact military is. How they will willingly die for their duty. How death can be lighter than a feather. She pointed to the mangled remains of one of the veiled archers. There wasn't even enough left of it for Disran to know what ship it had been. I did what needed to be done. I trusted in the loyalty of your crew and their willingness to fight and die for the compact, just as you did. Are you going to dishonor their sacrifice? Disran's hands flexed, the crawling sense of horror gone in a flash of anger, and he glared hatefully. He knew what she was doing, and he damned her soul, if humans even had such things, to the deepest, most inescapable depths of the black. No, emissary, he whispered, fighting to remain in control of himself. Their sacrifice will be remembered and honored. If there are no further surprises, I would suggest getting yourself to the boat bay and preparing for your mission. My Janissary teams will meet you there. She dipped her head in acknowledgement. Disran did not watch her leave, demanding status reports from what remained of his squadron. The emissary had indeed thrown the jackals off their stride, and he would take full advantage of it. Just as he would remember the look in her eyes as she had spoken so highly of his dead.